in the participants list. So now it's 1:30. So let's get going. So welcome to this meeting here for the ASDF working group at IETF112. And I realized there's actually the wrong date on the slide here. Forgot to change that. So I'm Niklas Widell, and with me, of course, we have Michael Richardson. Well, let's see how I actually change. So this is the note well, the high level thing. You will be recorded, or you are recorded already. Remember to be nice and be professional. We have a slightly expanded set of this one in a moment. And remember that the IPR guidelines of IETF is in effect. The link is there as well. For all the material relating to ASDF, there is the link on the repo. We're working on GitHub, and there's also the links to the notes for today, where Michael is taking notes. And Michael is also acting as Jabber scribe. Here is the full note well, or the more extended note well. You know it well, and you've seen it many times this week. You need to, well, this is what you sign up to when you participate in this meeting. You agree to follow IETF procedures and policies. We will not go into detail on this. Here is a slightly more expanded part of the code of conduct that hasn't been in a discussion lately. It's basically about treating your colleagues with respect, speak slowly, limit use of slang, dispute ideas by using recent arguments, use best engineering judgment, find best solution for whole internet, and contribute to the ongoing work of the group and the IETF. And so this is what you need to keep in mind when you participate in this meeting. We try to be polite to each other. And if you need more information, there's the RFC up there. This is the agenda for today. We've already done the note well. For the logistics, we have a CodeMD. Michael is taking notes. There was a link previously. You can find it. There's the Meet Echo, and you're on it right now. We don't do blue sheets because they are automatically generated. We will continue with the working group status update, and then continue with the main meat of the meeting, which is the SDF, getting SDF ready for working group last call. After that, we have a couple of new work items or related work that we will sort of be looking at, and we will sort of try to work out how to fit them into the bigger SDF story on protocol mappings, instances, and relationships. Finally, we are looking at the ASDF milestones. We do have a pretty packed agenda, so we will be moving along at a brisk pace. So, an admin, I mentioned all this already, so there's nothing special here. Decisions on mailing list and work on GitHub. And we try to do, in addition to these meetings at not the physical IETFs, but the virtual physical IETFs, we also do virtual interims, and we have had a couple so far. This is a status update where we are right now. We were chartered a year ago, a little more than a year ago, and we have had meetings at 2 IETFs. We have had hackathons at these 2 IETFs. Lately, before this one, we had my more unofficial or a simpler hackathon. We still work that generated 2 IDs, so it's good stuff anyway. We've had 4 virtual interims, and we've had a spec that has reached implementation draft status. And we're meeting today, and we're planning for another meeting soonish, maybe in January, and we'll come back to that later, depending on the discussion goes today. So, on a related thing to ASDF is, of course, the one data model, and the one data model was the activity that kicked off this work initially, created in 2018 to harmonize IoT data models across multiple ecosystems such as OCF and IPSO and Bluetooth, etc. And this group had 2 main objectives. One was it came out. 2 main objectives came out of this. One was this common format for defining data and interaction models, and this resulted in SDF, which we're of course working in this group here. And the other part is developing these industry best standard, best practice IoT device models and they are and putting them in a 1DM repository. And this was just a report that this work is ongoing, and we have a review board, and that work sort of on approving these models is happening right now. So hopefully by next time we meet, we can have actually some adopted models in 1DM, which are of course defined in SDF, but ready for anybody who can translate from SDF to their ecosystem. So with that, I leave over to Karsten to take us through what remains before we get to working group last call and on. Karsten, please.
Yeah, thank you. So there are a few things we have to do to become ready for working group last call. Of course, there is the draft itself, and we also need to do some administrational things, identify a document shepherd. That's usually done by the working group chair. So if you want to say anything about that, please do.
We have a proposal at least for Chris
Okay.
Holmberg to be the shepherd. I just checked with him, so I haven't been able to propagate the information. But
Okay.
so I think that will work out well. He has read the spec and so on, and he's happy to take it on.
Okay. So can you put the the name in the notes, please? So the other thing we need to do is work on the draft. And there are some 9 issues and 2 pull requests on the repository at this point. And there are a couple actual change requests. There is one issue that talks about the limitation with the formal description technique we are using, and we have to diagnose whether that's really something we need to work around or we can live with. There are various tasks that need to be done, just editorial tasks. There is some tools work that needs to be completed because Appendix B is generated out of Appendix A, and there are limitations in that tool. And there's also potentially future work that we will be talking about in the last 20 minutes of this working group meeting, which we don't have to complete. But we probably should look at it to make sure we don't paint ourselves into a corner here by doing something in the base draft that makes the future work harder. Next slide. So there are 2 change requests, and let's talk about the first one, pull request 45. It's too bad that Ari isn't here. We had a last-minute thing getting in the way. So we have much less experience with action and event affordances than with properties affordances. So each time somebody touches the action event stuff again, then yeah, it turns out it's maybe not the most streamlined way to talk about these affordances. And we thought we had fixed this in SDF 1.1, but maybe we swung the pendulum a little bit too far, and we may want to look at that again. So right now in SDF 1.1, we have a single data type definition for the input and a single definition for the output. And that is often a little bit unwieldy because it's very likely that your action will have more than one input. So pull request 45 suggests that maybe we make the object that we would use to carry all these different parameters implicit again. Next slide, please. So for the input side, it's quite usual to have multiple parameters. It's much less useful to have multiple parameters on the output side. So doing this for both or nothing, which we probably want to do for symmetry, means that one of them will be slightly harder to read than the other. But there is no functional limitation here. So what are currently property names will be some other kind of SDF name for the parameters. But that's probably not really a big change. So we had some discussion in the last few hours about that, and we weren't quite as sure anymore whether this is actually needed. So my request would be for people to look at the issue in more detail, or if you already have experienced this little bit of inconvenience, maybe you can tell us now. Okay, I'm not seeing people line up in the speaker queue. So maybe we can leave this by the wayside and talk about the next change request. Next slide. Right now, the structure of an SDF JSON file is that we have alternate levels of SDF categories, concepts, and specifier defined names. And these specifier defined names go into a single default namespace that is defined up there in the namespace block. And the question is, does it make sense to maybe allow a single specification to make definitions that turn up in different namespaces? It would be possible to do something like that. The problem is that I haven't seen a good proposal how we could continue to use JSON pointers in the straightforward way that we're using them now once we do that. Because the JSON pointers would actually have queries in them with prefixes that are defined in the spec the JSON pointer points into, and this is getting a bit ugly. So this is an issue right now. It's not a specific pull request. So if you think that this issue is important to address, then we should have a discussion on how we could actually make something work that addresses the issue. If we don't address it, it just means you have to have multiple SDF specs to export into different namespaces. And that's, of course, always a little bit, you have to juggle these different files. If you remember programming in Java, that is sometimes a little bit ugly. Michael.
What is the, why do people need to have to emit into multiple namespaces? What is the pull on the other side to doing that? I understand it's difficult for us to do it, but I understand why do people want to do it?
Yeah, so I think one can come up with a lot of use cases, but they are not that strong. So imagine you are writing a translation from an ecosystem model and want to factor out some data type that actually is interesting enough that you want to put it into a common library. Then you cannot have a single file that does these two things. And some people would argue, yeah, that's exactly what we want. We want that you write two files because one goes into the common library and the other one is the thing model that you are just creating. So that's why these use cases are weak, because you can always make the argument, if you're going into multiple namespaces, then it should be different files.
Library is on the side of SDF, not on the side of the output, the other side of the translated to, is what I think you're saying.
Yeah, so a translator should probably be able to consume multiple SDF models and translate it into something that is might be multiple models or a single model on the ecosystem side. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one translation, and that may be, yeah, it may require doing additional control files that control these interrelationships and so on. So Yeah, I'm having a hard time actually arguing for this because I'm pretty sure we don't want to do this, but I'm doing my best to make the argument here.
Unless someone's really speaking up for this, I think we should just let it go.
I agree to that. If
that Ari is not here at the moment.
Yeah, we need to check with Ari as well, or see if he joins later. But unless he objects, I think we should just skip this. Okay, thanks. Please continue.
Okay, next slide. So there is one little ugly thing. If you have an SDF choice and the alternatives are actually quite similar, then you don't want to repeat all the properties, that's the wrong word, all the qualities of each choice in every single alternative, but you want to factor them out. And that should be possible, but right now the way we are describing this choice makes it hard to do that, which is just one instance of a larger problem, which is that we are using the grammar to describe the input to the processing model. But the processing model actually has several steps, which could be called resolution steps, that generate the thing that really needs to conform to this grammar. So that's a limitation that the tools will have to struggle with. So they cannot simply validate input. They might have to do resolution first before they actually know whether everything that's required is present in the document because it has been pulled in using SDF-ref. Yeah, so that's one area where we might want to try to have some ideas, but unless people have ideas how to solve this, it probably will stay that way. This comes up in translator building if you have an enum or something in a source ecosystem and you're translating this, then you essentially have to blow up the attributes that come with this enum into the branches of the SDF choice. So it's not beautiful, but it's also not really killing us. Okay, if nobody cares about that, then let's go to the next one. Yeah, there are a number of tasks that need to be done before we can last call this, like do we use the optional commas in CDDL, and do our JSON text examples actually all pass? Can we add some automated checks and so on? And of course, we should try to collect more editorial reviews by people who are reading this for the first time and may be having trouble understanding some of the wording that we are using. So that's something that has to happen within the next couple of months to make sure that we have a readable document. If we don't do it now, then the ISG will force us to do it later, and that takes longer. Next slide. There's also a little bit of tool work needed. So there is one issue that describes how to actually make the co-occurrence constraints of the JSON schema inspired part of the CDDL a little bit more tight, but we cannot do this at the moment because the tool that translates CDDL into JSON schema org doesn't support this kind of structure. So we will need to fix the CDDL tool or do it by hand, but that's really not something I would want to do. Way too much potential for errors. Yeah, Michael asks who could give the document a read now to get this editorial stuff. Next slide. Okay, so there are a little set of items that are not in the next future work block, but that maybe we should look at. Do we want to do this now or leave it for future work? One is that we have a version field in the info block. We all know that versions are hard, and versions usually give us much less than they do. But if we have a version field, then it should have at least some reason for existence. And right now, it's not really defined how you would use that. There is a suggestion that it starts with an RFC 3339 or ISO 8601 date. So you can order versions lexicographically, but we may want to make a tighter definition of what the version field would be. So that's one thing we want to look at. And the other thing we may want to look at is when we are combining multiple SDF files, or more generally, if we are building SDF files out of multiple ecosystem sources, how do we combine the information in there? So right now there is only one copyright entry in the info block. By the way, there is no license field in the, or there is a license field in the info block, but it's not fully defined yet, and so on. And by the way, the OPS-A working group is working on a similar thing for MUD files. So they also try to get this metadata more precisely defined, so you have ownership and licensing statements in Yang. So maybe we also want to coordinate this a little bit so it works together. Elliot. Elliot?
Hi, Carson, thanks. Just a comment on that. Yeah, this is a draft that you and I are writing, and it's been accepted as a working group draft over in Ops Area WG, and the intent at least is for it not simply to be used as, for MUD files, but rather if you have stationary or static JSON that you're concerned, you need to have a licensing statement, you just sort of slap this in. And it should be general along those lines, so people should review it for in that context.
Yeah, so we may want to be compatible with this, either literally compatible or at least culturally compatible, so people will be able to extract that information in that form. And that's probably something that we want to pay a little bit of attention to. Next. Breadcrumbs. So we have these processing model steps where we put together specs out of multiple sources. And one observation was that when we do this, we lose the information, what sources these actually came from. Of course, that hurts in the info block, as I already said, but of course you also would like to be able to find out what kind of thing is this here, what kind of property action event is this here? Did this come from this or did this come from the other? So keeping some more comment level information. There's a pull request for that, which maybe doesn't quite have the right shape yet. And when we later come to mapping files, there's also a consideration that we may want to keep information about where parts of the specification came from. Of course, you can just put it into the comment fields, but then you will have a hard time tracing it back. So having a little bit more structured representation would be good. So that's one thing we may want to look at. And number 3, we may want to write up a little bit more of our own guidelines we used when writing this spec. So when the next version is generated, we remember what those guidelines were. So for instance, there is an old issue that asks, when do we use the term SDF XXX, and when do we just use a naked XXX? So why is it unit and not SDF unit? More generally, we might want to record invariants that we expect to be maintained during the evolution of the document. So if you say that again?
Can you give me an example of an invariant here?
Yeah, for instance, that we have this alternation between user-defined names and SDF-defined names, which we don't in the info block, which is an exception to that. But everywhere else we do. And this is essentially an artifact of the fact that JSON has limited expressibility. In the programming language, when you declare something, you give the type and the name. But we need two different levels of JSON to do that. And things like that, we probably want to explain, and maybe also explain why in the info block we haven't managed to keep that invariant. Yeah, so let's look at timelines, and I brought some rose-colored glasses for you to look at those timelines. Everything I have talked about here, we can do this year. And if this turns into substantive changes, then we probably want to have another implementation draft, which would be SDF 1.2. So people can actually touch their tools and converters and so on to make sure they actually work with the next version. If we don't make substantive changes, then we can continue calling this SDF 1.1 and don't have a transition in the tool space. And if we have the implementation draft this year, we probably will have a few nits to fix. And then we should be able to do a working group last call in mid-January, and should be able to process the working group last call comments up to, well, early February or something. And if Shepard and AD are fast, we could actually have an IETF last call during February. So if we manage to run this without larger surprises, we might have the telechat date in March. So this is what I want to achieve here. And we will have to see whether we can make it do, but I think we should not take, and authors are fast for Jessica indeed. We should think about whether we take up any significant changes that would jeopardize this timeline here. So that's
Okay.
what I had heard.
So thank you, Karsten. I mean, this sounds great. Sorry, was there anyone in the queue? No. This sounds really great. Thank you for making all this progress. Do you think that because we had these the first ones on this PR45 and the namespace issue, I guess we can resolve them within. That shouldn't be a showstopper. That needs to be resolved somehow, but they are not really showstoppers, right?
No, we should resolve them within the next 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And so we have some time for thinking and writing. So I don't see a problem there.
Okay, great. Any comments from the rest of the group? Great. Out of this, do you think we should have interim Should we try to plan an interim to follow this time plan, Han? Here, I guess we need to have an interim in a couple early next year or something to fix everything, or what do you think?
Well, there are several decision points here. Whether we have a decision point in December, I don't know yet, because I don't know whether we do an SDF 1.2, but if we actually do, then actually we should have an interim in December. And then the actual working group last call, at the end of that, we probably want to have an interim to process those comments. So that would be late in January. Yeah, then we have to react to the last call comments, to the AD comments, or to the Shepard report as well. So that's a bit harder to plan right now, but it might even be useful to have another one in February. So this would mean that we have about one per month of these.
Okay.
We don't have
Yes.
to, I mean, we can schedule them now, and if we decide we got by without them, we can just cancel them.
Yeah. So let's figure out how to schedule them afterwards. I think we can do that with a doodle or something. Great. No further comments on this or questions? I hope everybody will read the specification and figure out lots of questions so we can settle them quickly. Great. Let's move on then. I think we're actually ahead of schedule here by a couple of minutes, so this is really good. So we talked before about sort of things that is related to the basic SDF spec, but is sort of extending it slightly. So a couple of topics has come up, and this is the first one. Carsten, go ahead.
Yeah, so early in the development of SDF, we found out that there is some ecosystem-specific information that the ecosystems want to put into the SDF model, which makes it hard to actually have harmonized models, because each time an ecosystem starts to use a harmonized model, we would have to add information to that. So we thought that maybe it would be a good thing to have a way to do what the XML or HTML community does with style files, which are separate data that actually hook into the main document, the HTML document or the XML document in this case, and provide additional information. And we have discussed these for a while and have been thinking about applying CSS concepts or something like that to it. But actually, it turns out that what we need seems to be much simpler. And I have tried to write this up in a first draft before this meeting. So essentially, the processing model here is that you can take a slim harmonized model plus one or more mapping files and generate a fat model that has new qualities in them, and that's really probably the part that requires the largest amount of thinking. So it's structurally still an SDF spec, but it's not what you actually would harmonize in an organization like 1DM. It just has information from one or more ecosystems added to the base harmonized specification. So a mapping file essentially would start with the same info block and the same namespace management, namespaces and default namespace sections that you have in a normal SDF spec. But the rest would just be a sequence of pairs, or a map actually, in a JSON object, that maps a JSON pointer into the SDF spec to new qualities that would be added at this point in the spec. So it's like a set of editing instructions, except that the amount of editing you can do is limited there. And that's all pretty obvious. I mean, this should work very, very easily. There's just one problem. These qualities may not be part of the SDF language. So we want to have qualities in there that are specific to ecosystems. And next slide. So here's an example where we have an IPSO mapping for an SDF specification. And IPSO has these object and resource IDs. So that's something that is really specific to IPSO OMA lightweight M2M. It should really be the purview of those ecosystems to define these additional qualities. It should not be something that they have to run to the ASDF working group or fill in a registry with stuff each time. So apart from that, this looks workable. Well, it's a little bit verbose, but maybe we can fix some of this verbosity in the SDF compact work. So I'm optimistic that this is possible. Next slide. We did the same thing for the Web of Things thing models. We didn't do it for the thing descriptions, obviously, because that has instance information, which is a separate item on our list today. And yeah, we immediately fell into the trap here of using the wrong namespace, because the namespace really should be the namespace of the model that we are augmenting. And the namespace that is listed here is actually the one in which the terms titles and descriptions are defined, because what already uses a namespace system. So these are the qualities that we are adding. So Web of Things gives us a kind of a direction in which we want to go here. So maybe we need to have two different namespaces here, one for the qualities and one for the pointers into the spec. Michael, you had your microphone on? Michael Kostner? Okay. Yeah, so my diagnosis at the moment is we haven't painted ourselves in a corner yet. We can make these mapping files work, and they can be simple. And the next step will be using them in more converters. So the Yang converter, for instance, currently dumps a lot of ecosystem-specific stuff into description qualities, where it will be hard to parse out again. And it would be much better if it actually generated a mapping file instead to keep this Yang-specific information. Okay, I think that's what I had.
Thank you, Karsten. So you mean that the mapping files in your experimentation with that in the proposal is not breaking anything with the main SDF spec?
Well, the one thing where they touch, the main thing where they touch is in the area of qualities. How do we maintain this quality space? And similar to units where we have SDF defined values and other values, we might want to do the same thing for quality names. So that actually changes the data model of SDF somewhat, but in a limited way, I think.
It's, yeah. It still seems like, I mean, if there is a better, I mean, yeah. I mean, it is kind of sort of semantic information that's good to sort of keep in a consistent way. So maybe we should explore if there is a way, as you said, to add it or change it. Yeah. But okay. There is nothing here, at least, that prevents us from moving on with SDF specification as is, since we can
Yeah, I
make
would
it
agree
work.
with that. Yeah.
Okay, good. Any comments or questions? I guess people are burnt out after a full week. Then we move on.
Yeah, who wants to speak to Ari's slides?
Yeah, we had a bit of a problem because Ari was supposed to present these and he had to drop at the last minute for some other non-work stuff, I think. Well, let's see. I can maybe sort of. Do you want to talk to it, Kirsten, or I can?
Well, I can try.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, given that the world we are coming from here is the hypermedia world, where we are describing things in terms of resources and links, it's probably a good idea to think about how links would improve our situation in SDF. And yeah, looking at the way we are using links, we already have them in SDF-Ref and so on, but maybe we should have a little bit of a wider look at this. And there are, of course, some implicit links, the parent-child relationship within the tree structure of the SDF specification. That's obviously a form of link. We can make explicit links in terms of cross-references using SDF-Ref, but these are very specific things because they mean we do wholesale inclusion of the target of the link. Yeah, so yeah, next slide. Maybe we want to be able to describe the fact that I'm always wanting to say things, but this is not the right word. Concepts are linked in more interesting ways than just inclusion. For instance, if we have a heater, there's maybe a boiler somewhere that we want to that has a temperature that we want to read off that boiler. Or if there is a switch, a light switch, then probably there is a light somewhere. So these are definitions that describe relationships between instances, but then these relationships in turn have properties that we may want to see at the class level. Because a heater that is meant to heat a boiler, if you put that into a pot for cooking something, that might not work too well. So you may want to put the information that this heater is actually supposed to have a link to a boiler into the definition. So we have links at the instance level that we want to describe at the class level. But we also have links at the class level. We have to be really careful about what kind of link we are really talking about. When we have a link, then of course you want to have link relations with that describe what this link is about. In the web world, we have link relations registry, and that's essentially the predicate of an ontology, if you look more closely at it. And you may want to put in other information like cardinality and so on, and what fits into the target position for the link and so on. So let's look at the example on the next slide. Here we have a robot arm that is somehow highly related to some other robot arm. So these arms are not just there and like ships in the night, but they need to know about each other. Or at least in this example, arm A needs to know about arm B. So you want to be able to say that there is a relation here to something that is of SDF type, SDF thing Robert arms, SDF object arm B. So this is an example. Maybe mapping this to SDF qualities isn't quite done right yet, but it might demonstrate what we mean here. Next slide. So the instance relations, for instance, might be a light switch controls a particular light. That relation is something like a property in some way, but it's also an affordance you would exercise in a different way than a normal property. So if you know the light switch is on or off, that's of a different quality than you know, knowing what that light switch actually is controlling. So some of this is runtime information or instance information, some of it is definition information, and we want to be able to describe these links. And the reason why this is all a little bit pressing is that in lightweight M2M, there are object links, and these are runtime links. And of course, you want to be able to describe them in an SDF model. Next slide. So we might have a property which is which light is being controlled by this light switch, and it's of type link. Or we may want to model this as a new kind of affordance, but in the end, this will look very similar to the previous example. So next slide. When we talk about instance information, and I have to do a little bit of karaoke right now because I'm not entirely sure I understand what Ari is talking about. He sees two different approaches between himself and Michael. Next slide. So there are instance definitions which describe a specific object. So for instance, a Web of Things thing description is an instance definition. It's not a class definition. SDF is about class definitions. So in a thing description, they didn't have to do the intellectual work of separating out qualities that describe a specific instance and qualities that are similar enough between all these instances that you might want to put it into a class. Yeah, so class, kind, type, instance. Next slide. We need to work on the words we're using for this. There's only a limited number of English words, and many of them have connotations of previous uses that make them difficult to use. So if we have an SDF model, which is a class, do we maybe want to have a separate instance definition which somehow relates to this SDF model? By the way, this could look a lot like the mapping file I talked about, again, by adding qualities to the existing tree structure of the model. So we could have the ability to give identities, identifiers, whatever, to instances. We could describe the purpose of life relations between the instances. Yeah, I don't understand the last bullet. Of course, you want to be able to put all the qualities that are in a thing description into this instance definition. It would just save us a lot of work because we can just use the structures they already have defined. So last slide in this deck, instance SDF.
Just a quick comment on
quick
comment on this last line there. I think the idea here was to have these instances, or whatever we call them, as not as, what should I say, runtime instances that have a particular state. So the instance Ari is talking mostly about here is this sort of instance without the current state.
Yeah, it's not the actual digital twin. It's the definition of a specific digital twin. Okay.
So, good.
Yeah, next slide.
Yeah, I'm trying to, there you go.
Yeah, okay. So this looks almost the same like what we already had, but the point is here, now we have a specific name or ID for the thing, for the instance. So the instance is not an instance of a specific state of the thing, which is yet another way of going down one turtle. But it's the description of the instance, so it's on the same level as what thing description. And we would have the vocabulary here to do this. Okay, I hope I haven't done this too much disservice. And the next one is the alternative view is Michael's view. So Michael, please go ahead.
So just right back on that last slide is a good segue where he says instance of. I think what the main difference between what Ari was proposing and what I'm proposing, and different approaches, not so different. But where he says instance of, I would just use SDF-ref there because we're really bringing in that definition and we're using it to customize it. So next slide, please. Okay, so what I really see is that what we have are layered constraints on definitions. You start with a base definition, you refine it and compose it with others, and you get reusability at all the levels. And it's not clear whether it at any time really becomes an instance until it has a protocol binding. But in between there, and to address what Karsten was saying, what you need with relations and all, and this is more than just breadcrumbs, but what seems to make sense is when you have reusable objects, you could take all the trouble to go and classify them and name them and everything, but really what you want to do is build an application graph out of reusable objects. So you have an on-off object, but you want to use it for different things in its context, and its context is going to be set by a graph that has other objects that relate to it in specific ways. So you can either, as Karsten said, make a thing and make everything subparts of the thing, or do something that's a little more level and not so hierarchical. And we find that very often we need to do the hierarchical thing and can't just make it all level. Because also we have to describe communication between things and how they're connected, not so much communication always in the digital form, but how they're connected in the application graph. So objects are connected and related. And so this is a way to basically make your application graph portable and retargetable. So I could cast it onto, retarget it onto OMA lightweight M2M objects just by filling in the object links to at runtime or at generation time when I generate the actual runtime thing and put protocol bindings in. At that time, I would generate the actual links and assign the namespace IDs if I needed to, if they weren't already done, and then do the on-the-air schemas and protocol binding. So I don't see it any time it really becomes an instance until you actually give it a network address and actually embody a state to it. Until then, you're describing things that get closer to instances, and it's more like layered constraints. Next slide, please. I'll just take questions at the end. So I wanted to also talk about a little bit about the language-specific features that we're talking about. And what we really need to do is more than just breadcrumbs. There are places where we need to use the JSON pointer to an SDF definition in specific ways that aren't just expanding it like SDF-ref does, but rather to use it in relations and in the composition that I was just talking about to build application graphs. So really, SDF is the best thing. You know, the dependency here on our first release would be, do we really want to keep calling it SDF-ref? Because SDF-ref from doesn't really capture the meaning, in my opinion, and we really need to think about whether we want to say SDF expand or something like that. And, you know, we had this discussion and, you know, maybe it's too late and we can't really rename SDF ref, but really if there is a last opportunity, it's now, and the window is going to close with 1.2. So it's kind of too bad we already use it so much, but actually I think it might make sense to use SDF ref for the thing that does not do expansion and invent a new term for the one that does, but we need more discussion on this. Next slide, please. Okay, another feature of the semantic links, as I see them, they're semantic links, they're subject, predicate, object triples, and you know, their web links work that way too. So subject is, though, always pretty much the present definition. We don't necessarily need a context override or quads or anything like that, but what we do need is the predicates, and then the objects. They can be an SDF pointer, which is one behavior to semantically define the relationship from one SDF object to another. And sometimes if you're, for example, lightweight M to M, you just need to constrain what kind of objects you can point to when you build your instance graph or implementation. So a lot of it is using these references in links, but wanting to be able to describe it with a predicate that says, you know, target type or something like that, right? So also they can be external references, though, that are just any old URI. So we want to be able to integrate with RDF using this pattern as well. Next slide, please. I think this is the last one.
I'm afraid we are kind of running out of time here.
I know. I think this is the last one. Okay, yeah. So protocol binding. Yeah, this is just, okay, Carsten already covered this. So this is basically, but I wanted to say one thing is that I did an experiment where I used the Web of Things protocol binding vocabulary as a SDF extension. Using the vocabulary extension technique similar to what, almost identical to what Carsten showed earlier, and then use that to generate TDs. And that was, I found that to use it as an annotation on SDF and then use it in the generation to do very good workflow. I think that's the last slide. Can you see if there's one more?
No, that's the last one.
I'm done. Then I'm done.
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you very much. Any super quick questions on this?
I just wanted to say, let's have an interim where we go into any detail, but yes. Yeah, quick questions.
Carsten, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I look at these slides and we're not sure whether we were talking about the same thing, but I'm now convinced that we have a pretty close direction, common direction, maybe with the exception of whether we want to reuse that term SDF ref, which we kind of inherited from JSON schema.org and renamed slightly, but we should have renamed it more radically. But apart from that, I think we have very similar ideas. And I think the what thing description is really a nice benchmark that we can use here, because it is at the instance level, and we can make sure that the levels of turtles we build here actually is able to reach down to that thing description. So let's have that intro.
Okay, thank you. And that was the last of our presentations. I think that actually segues quite nicely to your the setting up the next interims, Michael Richardson. I gave you 2 seconds.
So I posted into the channel, into the Jabber and into the minutes, a doodle poll for virtual interims in December, January, and February. So we'll pick one, sorry, we're going to pick 3 values from that. There are several weeks, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I have picked the hour before the 1 DM meeting, which I recognize as early for Michael Koster, and the hour afterwards, which is now getting into late in Europe, on the Monday or the Tuesday of several weeks in each month. So please pick them appropriately, assuming that we will pick 3 values in there. And it sounds like we really want a December meeting, a virtual interim, and that we possibly might cancel or skip January, depending on how well we're doing with shepherding and other things, but that we absolutely want a February virtual interim to deal with any issues arising from a possible working group last call that might have occurred after the occurred in January. And we had previously done 90-minute meetings. I think we should try to stick to more frequent 60-minute and get right into things. So that's about it. And yeah, go ahead with the milestone review part from the last 3 minutes or 1 minute we have left.
Yeah, last, well, 2 seconds, right? Just a quick thing here, milestone review. We are developing SDF according to milestone. We're supposed to be sending it on in September. We are on track, but with a slight delay, of course. And during this work, we have identified additional interesting work, like the one we just discussed on protocol mappings and relationships and instances. And we need to figure out whether that fits within the big document, simple extensions to that, or whether we actually need to have more complicated extensions, which would then sort of be beyond the scope of the ASDF group. But if that happens, we will sort of looking at the sort of need to recharter. And of course, we would also like to be around long enough that we can have at least one face-to-face meeting during the lifetime of this working group.
No, we want to close down before having never seen anybody, right?
No, I mean that would be a first, right? But yeah. Thank you all. Thank you for attending. Have a great final hour and a half of IETF meetings this time, and see some of you on interims and some of you at the next face-to-face meeting or whatever happens with that time. Thank you very much. Bye.
Great. Thank you. Push the button. Which button? There we go.